Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little pungent. A time of stench, chamber pots, and powdered wigs. We're exploring what life was really like in the 18th century. Forget the fancy dresses and elegant balls Hollywood loves to show you. The truth is, you probably wouldn't survive a single day without gagging at the smells. So, before we plunge into the grime, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you actually enjoy this deep dive into history. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see. If you were dropped into an 18th century city, the first thing you'd notice isn't the fashion, the horse-drawn carriages, or the powdered wigs. It's the smell. And not just any smell. We're talking about an all-consuming, nose-burning, eye-watering wall of stench so powerful, you'd wonder if you'd accidentally walked into the world's largest open sewer. Forget the romantic images of powdered nobles twirling through ballrooms. Daily life in the 1700s reeked. Literally. So tonight, let's take a walk through the streets of an 18th century city. London, Paris, maybe even Philadelphia, and see what your nose would have to endure. Spoiler, you're going to want to breathe through your mouth. Step outside your door, and the city greets you like a slap in the face. Cobblestone streets are slick with mud, horse manure, and, if you're unlucky, human waste. See? Chamber pots, those little bowls people relieve themselves in overnight, had to be emptied somehow. And the fastest method? Open the window and dump it straight into the street. With luck, you'd shout, "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," before unleashing yesterday's stew onto some poor pedestrian's head. With no luck, you just dumped. Now add in the horses. Thousands of them. They pulled carts, carriages, and wagons, each producing around 20 to 30 pounds of manure a day. In a city like London, that meant hundreds of tons of horse droppings piling up on the streets every single day. Mix in some rain, and you've got rivers of manure flowing down cobblestones. In summer, it baked under the sun until the entire neighborhood smelled like a barnyard left out to rot. And if you're thinking, well, surely they cleaned it up. Yes and no. There were street sweepers, but the scale was overwhelming. More often than not, waste just sat there, turning into a paste that clung to your shoes, your clothes, and eventually, your home. Now let's head to the marketplace. Fresh bread, cheeses, salted fish. All good smells, right? But here's the catch. Refrigeration didn't exist. Meat hung out in the open, buzzing with flies. Fish brought in from the docks might already be half spoiled by the time it reached the stalls. Imagine the reek of raw meat, old blood, and scales mixing with warm summer air. Add the occasional burst of rotting cabbage, spilled beer, or curdled milk, and suddenly you understand why most shoppers kept a kerchief close. Half for fashion, half to block the odor. Vendors tried to mask the stench by dousing food stalls with vinegar or spices. But vinegar only does so much when the pig carcass in front of you is turning green. All right, let's escape the streets and step inside a home. Surely it's better in there, right? Not exactly. Most houses had poor ventilation, smoky hearths, and damp walls. Candles made of animal fat, called tallow, were cheap and common. But when burned, they released a smell best described as wet dog left in a frying pan. Bedding and upholstery rarely saw soap and water. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or feathers that absorbed sweat, spilled ale, and body odor. Over time, your bed developed a smell of its own, a personal musk that clung to you like a shadow. And don't even get started on body odor. Regular bathing wasn't common. Many people feared that immersing the body in water opened the pores and let disease creep in. So instead, folks wiped themselves with a damp cloth, maybe dabbed some perfume, and called it a day. Imagine layers upon layers of unwashed skin, sweat, and dirt building up over weeks or months. Now multiply that by an entire family in a single-room home. That's what domestic bliss smelled like. Here's where things get really personal. People themselves were walking clouds of stench. Clothing was rarely laundered. Wool, linen, and silk were hard to wash, so most people just wore them until they couldn't anymore. Underwear? Worn for weeks. Shirts? Maybe swapped once a fortnight, if you were lucky. Mouths weren't much better. Toothbrushes existed, but they weren't widespread. Many people cleaned their teeth with a cloth, a twig, or not at all. Decay, gum disease, and abscesses were common, giving rise to a permanent cloud of bad breath that no amount of clove or mint could mask. Hair? Lice and fleas were practically roommates. People powdered their wigs and scalps not just for fashion, but to cover up the greasy, itchy reality beneath. That perfumed powder might smell nice for 5 minutes, but give it a few hours, and it just smelled like sweetened sweat. Here's the kicker. You couldn't escape the smell. It clung to everything. The smoke of coal fires filled the air, mixing with the stench of human and animal waste, the rot of markets, and the musk of unwashed bodies. Cities were hazy with a kind of odor fog. Visitors often wrote about being overwhelmed the moment they arrived. Some even claimed they could smell London before they could see it. And on hot summer days, it was unbearable. Waste fermented in the heat. Drains overflowed. Rats thrived. The whole city smelled like a giant compost heap mixed with a slaughterhouse. So, how did 18th century people deal with this? Well, mostly, they didn't. Odor was part of life. People expected it. They masked it with perfume, carried pomanders, little scent-filled balls, or walked with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses. Wealthy women sometimes carried vinegar-soaked sponges in fancy containers to hold under their noses when the streets got especially bad. But for most people, you just got used to it. When everyone smells, no one notices. At least not enough to do anything drastic about it. So, if you ever find yourself fantasizing about time travel, imagining yourself strutting through an 18th century city in your finest brocade coat or silk gown, remember this. The true fashion accessory of the time wasn't lace or jewels. It was a strong stomach. Because the past didn't just look different, it smelled different. And for us, that smell would be unforgettable, unavoidable, and nearly unbearable. But this was just the beginning. Because hygiene, or the lack of it, didn't just affect how people smelled. It shaped how they lived, how they got sick, how they loved, and how they survived. And in the chapters ahead, we'll dive deeper into the strange, dirty, and surprisingly fascinating world of 18th century hygiene. Picture this. You've just trudged through the muck of an 18th century city. Your shoes are caked in mud, horse manure, and whatever was dumped out of a chamber pot this morning. Your clothes cling with sweat. And your body? Let's just say ripe doesn't begin to cover it. So naturally, you'd want a nice hot bath, right? Wrong. In the 18th century, bathing wasn't routine. In fact, for many people, it was downright suspicious. The act of soaking your body in water, the very thing we associate with cleanliness, was often considered dangerous, unhealthy, and, frankly, a little weird. To understand why, you have to step into the medical mindset of the time. Doctors and common folk alike believed that water opened up the pores, leaving you vulnerable to illness. If you washed too much, you weren't just freshening up, you were inviting death to climb in through your skin. This idea tied into the old medical theory of miasma, or bad air. People thought sickness spread through foul smells, and if your pores were open, those invisible poisons would seep straight into your body. So, ironically, being too clean was considered unhealthy. Better to let a natural coating of dirt and oil form a protective barrier between you and the deadly outside world. Now, let's say you ignored the warnings and decided to bathe anyway. Where would you even do it? Running water in private homes was rare. Only the wealthy elite had anything close to a bathroom, and even then, it was often just a tub filled by servants carrying bucket after bucket of heated water from the kitchen. For everyone else, there were public bathhouses. But by the 18th century, their reputation had plummeted. Once popular in medieval Europe, bathhouses had become associated with immorality, disease, and, shall we say, unsavory activities. Many cities shut them down entirely. So the average person was left with a wash basin, a rag, and a lot of wishful thinking. Of course, if you had money, you had options. Aristocrats and nobles could afford elaborate bathing rituals, though even they didn't do it often. A noble might indulge in a perfumed bath once or twice a month, more for relaxation and show than for hygiene. These baths weren't just about soap and scrubbing. They were theatrical events. Imagine a clawfoot tub set in a candlelit chamber. Servants would haul in steaming water, then add herbs, oils, or even milk to soften the skin. Perfumes were sprinkled liberally: rose water, lavender, orange blossom, not to clean the body, but to mask whatever odors lingered underneath. And, after the bath, powdered wigs, scented pomanders, and heavily perfumed clothing ensured that any remaining stench was politely disguised. In high society, you didn't necessarily have to be clean. You just had to smell expensive. Now, let's walk down from the mansions into the alleys. For peasants, artisans, and laborers, bathing was a luxury they couldn't even dream of. Heating water required fuel, and fuel was costly. Why waste firewood or coal on a full bath when you needed it to cook food or keep warm in the winter? For most, the idea of filling a whole tub with hot water was unthinkable. Instead, the poor relied on dry cleaning methods, wiping the face and hands with a damp cloth, changing linen shirts when possible, or, in extreme cases, scraping off layers of dirt with a knife. Yes, literally scraping it off. Children grew up, married, worked, and died, having never taken what we would recognize as a proper bath. For many, soap wasn't even a household item. Here's the fascinating part. This wasn't necessarily seen as shameful. Unlike today, when cleanliness is tied to social respectability, dirt was just normal. If everyone smelled, then no one smelled bad. A musky odor wasn't a flaw. It was a human condition. In fact, many thought washing too often was vanity, even dangerous to moral character. Priests sometimes warned against the sin of excessive bathing, equating it with lust or idleness. A clean body didn't mean a clean soul. So how did people manage? They turned to their clothes. Linen shirts and chemises, worn close to the skin, acted like primitive sponges. These undergarments absorbed sweat, oils, and dirt, sparing the outer garments. Changing into fresh linen was, in many cases, considered as good as taking a bath. The wealthy could afford to change linen daily. The poor? Weekly, if that. And washing those garments was an ordeal. Boiling water, lye soap, pounding clothes on stones. So instead of bathing, most people simply swapped their shirts. Cleanliness became not about skin, but about fabric. Let's be honest, though. No matter how much linen you wore, your body still reeked. So how did people handle it? Perfume. And lots of it. The 18th century was the golden age of perfumery. Scented powders were puffed onto wigs and bodies. Pomanders, little balls filled with herbs and spices, were carried in pockets or worn around the neck. Wealthy women even tucked perfumed handkerchiefs into their corsets, pressing them to their noses whenever a particularly ripe smell wafted through the air. In some courts, the cloud of cologne and rosewater was said to be so thick it could knock you dizzy before the stench of unwashed flesh broke through. Perfume didn't clean anyone, but it created the illusion of freshness, a social mask that allowed people to ignore what was happening underneath. There was a bit of variation depending on where you lived. Rural communities with access to rivers or lakes sometimes washed more often, at least in summer. A quick plunge in a stream could double as both relief from the heat and a rare full-body clean. But city dwellers were far less likely to risk it. Urban rivers were polluted, carrying sewage, animal carcasses, and industrial waste. In London, the Thames was so foul by the late 1700s that people avoided it whenever possible. Swimming in it was closer to marinating in disease than getting clean. Interestingly, doctors occasionally prescribed bathing, but not for hygiene. It was considered a medical treatment. Mineral baths and spas became popular among the upper classes. Places like Bath in England or Aachen in Germany drew crowds who believed the waters could heal gout, rheumatism, or infertility. People weren't there to scrub. They were there to soak up curative powers. These spa trips often included days or weeks of lounging in sulfurous water, drinking mineral concoctions, and strolling around in wet linens. Did it clean them? Maybe a little. But the goal wasn't cleanliness. It was therapy. So, what did bathing, or not bathing, do to people in the 18th century? It shaped how they thought about health, class, and even morality. To bathe too much was risky. To smell too strong was normal. To hide the odor with perfume was stylish. For the poor, dirt was survival. For the rich, perfume was protection. And for everyone, the idea of a daily shower, something we take for granted, would have seemed bizarre, unnecessary, maybe even dangerous. So next time you step into your bathroom, twist the tap, and watch hot water flow effortlessly into a clean, private tub. Remember that for most of human history, this would have been unimaginable luxury. Because in the 18th century, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness. It was next to impossible. Imagine stepping into a glittering ballroom in 18th century Paris or London. Chandeliers sparkle, violins play, and a sea of aristocrats twirl across the polished floors. The women wear gowns so wide they could block a doorway. The men, towering wigs that make them look half a foot taller than they really are. At first glance, it's dazzling. But lean in just a little closer, and you'd discover something far less glamorous. It wasn't just curls and powder up there. Those magnificent wigs often crawled with lice, fleas, and sometimes worse. Yes, beneath the elegance and the perfume was a world of itching, scratching, and infection. To understand how lice-infested wigs became all the rage, we have to rewind to the late 1600s. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King himself, began losing his hair. For a monarch obsessed with image, baldness simply wouldn't do. His solution? A massive flowing wig. What Louis did, the aristocracy copied. Soon, wigs weren't just a fashion choice. They were a symbol of power, wealth, and authority. If you wanted to be taken seriously at court or in business, you needed one of those powdered marvels on your head. By the 18th century, wigs were everywhere. Politicians, judges, military officers, and fashionable ladies all wore them. Some were modest, but others were enormous. Towering constructions dusted in white powder. But under that beautiful facade lurked problems. Here's the unpleasant truth. Wigs were the perfect breeding ground for lice and fleas. Think about it. Many wigs were made from real human hair, stitched together with animal hair. Horse, goat, even yak. Combine that with powder made from flour or starch, plus oils and pomades to keep it styled, and you had a warm, sticky, food-filled nest sitting right on top of the scalp. Parasites didn't just find wigs comfortable. They thrived there. Lice laid their eggs in the strands. Fleas nestled in the crevices. The wearer? They were left scratching constantly. And here's the kicker. Unlike your own hair, you couldn't just wash a wig easily. Regular laundering would ruin the structure and the powder. So most wigs were only cleaned occasionally, if at all. Instead, people tried to refresh them with more powder and more perfume, covering the smell, but never solving the infestation. If you're picturing an aristocrat gracefully sipping champagne while ignoring the crawling under their wig, think again. People scratched. Often. They developed discreet little movements. A quick rub behind the ear. A casual pat of the head. But sometimes the itching got so bad that people resorted to wig scratchers. Long, thin tools, often made of ivory or metal, that they could slip under the wig and rake across their scalp without removing the whole contraption. Yes, wig scratchers. Fashion may have dictated beauty, but comfort required a secret weapon. But lice weren't just itchy nuisances. They could cause real damage. Constant scratching broke the skin, leaving sores and scabs. And in a world before antibiotics, those sores could easily become infected. Add to that the dirt and oils that collected beneath a wig, especially when the scalp wasn't washed regularly. And you had a recipe for chronic skin problems. Some people suffered from rashes, oozing wounds, and even more serious infections that left scars. Ironically, the wigs that symbolized sophistication often left the scalps beneath them in miserable condition. Let's talk about wig powder. It wasn't just about fashion. It was about hygiene, or at least the appearance of it. Powder helped whiten the wig, cover up yellowing strands, and add a pleasant smell. Popular scents included lavender, orange, and rose. But there was a downside. Wig powder was usually made from flour or starch, sometimes mixed with powdered chalk, and parasites loved it. For lice and fleas, powder wasn't a deterrent. It was dinner. Picture an aristocrat sprinkling fresh powder onto their wig, thinking it made them glamorous, while in reality, they were feeding the very creatures making their life miserable. Now here's where things get even stranger. Lice weren't just a private embarrassment. They were so common, they became part of daily life. In fact, there were wig makers and barbers who specialized in cleaning wigs, picking out lice, washing them with special solutions, and then restyling them. For a fee, of course. The wealthy could afford to have their wigs deloused regularly. The poor, however, often had to make do. Their wigs, if they had them at all, stayed dirty, smelly, and crawling. The divide between classes wasn't just about the size of the wig, but also the level of infestation you could afford to manage. Both men and women wore wigs in the 18th century, though in different styles. For women, wigs could be enormous, sculpted into extravagant towers adorned with ribbons, feathers, or even miniature ships. Yes, ships. Entire model ships. But the bigger the wig, the harder it was to keep clean. More surface area meant more powder, more oils, and more hiding places for lice. Some women even resorted to sleeping upright so their elaborate wigs wouldn't collapse, which only gave the bugs more uninterrupted time to crawl and bite. Remember, these wigs weren't worn in a vacuum. They existed in cities already reeking with waste, unwashed bodies, and rotting food. The perfume and powder helped mask some of that, but they also mixed with it. Imagine the sour odor of sweat beneath the floral scent of rose powder. The powder itself often turned rancid over time, especially when mixed with oils. So not only did wigs itch, they also smelled, and everyone knew it. Yet they remained a fashion must-have. By the late 18th century, wigs began to lose their charm. Revolutionaries in France mocked them as symbols of decadence. In England, the rising middle class began to prefer natural hair, which was cheaper and easier to maintain. But another factor helped bring wigs down: the sheer nuisance of keeping them. The lice, the sores, the powder, the expense, it all became too much. Simpler hairstyles gained popularity, and wigs slowly faded from daily fashion, surviving mostly in legal and ceremonial settings. When we look back at portraits of powdered gentlemen or towering haired ladies, it's easy to see elegance and refinement. But the reality, just beneath the surface, was crawling with problems. Wigs gave 18th century society its iconic look. But they also left people itching, scratching, and sometimes scarred. So the next time you see a powdered wig in a painting or a costume drama, remember, behind that stylish facade was a battlefield of humans versus parasites. And let's just say, the parasites often won. Imagine walking into a crowded tavern in 18th century London. The air is thick with smoke, ale sloshes in wooden mugs, and laughter fills the room. But as you get closer to the locals, there's something else in the air. A smell so sharp and sour it makes you instinctively recoil. It isn't the beer, it isn't the food, it's their mouths. Because in the 18th century, dental care was nearly non-existent. Tooth decay, rotten gums, and unbearable breath weren't just common. They were normal. Today, a bright white smile is a sign of health and beauty. But in the 1700s, the average mouth looked more like a battlefield. Teeth were yellowed or blackened. Cavities ate through enamel. Many people were missing teeth altogether, leaving wide gaps when they spoke or smiled. And remember, sugar consumption was skyrocketing in Europe during this time. Tea, coffee, chocolate, pastries, and sweets had become fashionable luxuries. But with no toothbrushes in most homes, no toothpaste as we know it, and almost no understanding of dental hygiene, sugar turned mouths into decay factories. The result? By middle age, most people had mouths riddled with pain, rot, and infection. Toothaches were so common in the 18th century that they were written about in diaries, letters, even poetry. It wasn't just discomfort, it was agony. Imagine a sharp, throbbing pain that never stops, radiating up into your jaw, temple, even your ear. And remember, no painkillers, no anesthetics. People tried desperate remedies: rinsing with vinegar, chewing herbs, smoking tobacco to numb the pain, or applying hot cloths. Some even tied toads or other magical items to their jaws, hoping superstition could succeed where medicine failed. But when the pain became unbearable, there was only one option left. Dentistry in the 18th century wasn't a specialized profession. If you needed a tooth pulled, you went to a barber, a blacksmith, or even a traveling tooth drawer at the local fair. The procedure was simple, quick, and excruciating. A pair of iron forceps was clamped around the tooth. Then, with brute strength, the practitioner yanked it out. No anesthetic. no numbing, just raw pain. Sometimes the tooth shattered, leaving jagged fragments that caused ongoing infections. Sometimes the force of the pull broke the jawbone, and if the gum became infected afterward, which happened often, it could be fatal. Because remember, in an age before antibiotics, something as small as an abscessed tooth could lead to sepsis and death. Of course, the wealthy had another option: false teeth. But don't picture today's sleek dentures. In the 18th century, false teeth were crude, uncomfortable, and often grotesque. Some were carved from ivory, which stained quickly and smelled foul. Others were made from animal teeth, usually horses. And the most prized, and most disturbing, came from human corpses. Grave robbers and battlefield scavengers sold teeth to dentists, who fitted them into dentures for the elite. These dentures were clunky and ill-fitting, often slipping out mid-conversation. They could make speaking and eating awkward, and they didn't fix the smell. If anything, they added to it. Still, they were better than showing a mouthful of black stumps. Now let's talk about halitosis, bad breath. Today, we consider it embarrassing. But in the 18th century, it was so common that it was socially accepted. If you walked into a salon or a coffee house, the air would be thick with foul odors from rotting teeth and infected gums. People were so used to it that they barely noticed. Writers of the time even joked about the perfume of the mouth, a sarcastic nod to how normal it was to reek when you spoke. Perfume and powders might cover the body, but the mouth? That was another story. Because extractions were so painful, many people avoided them at all costs. They would live for years with rotten teeth, enduring daily pain rather than face the iron forceps. This gave rise to the image of the 18th century man or woman with sunken cheeks and thin, pursed lips, their teeth too rotten or missing to smile freely. Portraits of the time rarely show teeth, not just because artists preferred serious expressions, but because people were ashamed to reveal the horror inside their mouths. Ironically, bad teeth weren't only a sign of neglect. They could also signal wealth. Sugar, imported from colonies, was expensive. The wealthy consumed it in abundance, and their decaying, blackened teeth became a visible mark of privilege. In fact, in some circles, sugar teeth were almost fashionable. Aristocrats might joke about their rotting smiles as a badge of indulgence. The poor, who couldn't afford sugar, often had fewer cavities, at least until cheap sugar became widespread later in the century. By the mid to late 18th century, a new profession started to form: dentistry. Practitioners like Pierre Fauchard in France, often called the father of modern dentistry, began publishing works on oral hygiene, cavities, and dental surgery. He recommended cleaning teeth with powders made of chalk or crushed shells, scraping away tartar, and even filling cavities with lead or tin. It was primitive compared to today's standards, but it was revolutionary for the time. Slowly, awareness spread that tooth care mattered. But for most ordinary people, these ideas were far beyond reach. So, what did the average 18th century mouth look and smell like? Picture a row of crooked yellow teeth, dotted with black cavities, gums swollen and bleeding from constant infection, a breath so foul it lingered in the air after a person spoke. Toothaches were endured until the pain was unbearable, then treated with brutal extractions. False teeth were luxuries for the rich, while the poor suffered in silence. And all of it was considered a normal part of life. We often romanticize the 18th century: powdered wigs, elegant gowns, candlelit balls. But behind the glamour was a grim truth: mouths that were decayed, diseased, and agonizing. Today, a cavity means a quick trip to the dentist. In the 1700s, it could mean months of agony, or even death. So next time you brush your teeth or complain about a trip to the dentist, spare a thought for the men and women of the 18th century, who would have given anything for a tube of toothpaste and a little Novocaine. Picture this. You're strolling down a narrow 18th century street on a hot summer day. The sun beats down, flies swarm in the air, and suddenly, splat! A bucket of foul-smelling liquid comes crashing down from an upstairs window. It's not water. It's human waste. Welcome to the daily reality of sanitation in the 1700s, where chamber pots, open sewers, and the stench of human life filled the air. If you thought modern traffic was bad, imagine dodging rivers of filth just to get to the marketplace. Let's start inside the home. Toilets as we know them today didn't exist for most people. Instead, there was the trusty chamber pot, a ceramic or metal bowl tucked under the bed or in a corner. When nature called in the middle of the night, you didn't wander outside. You grabbed the pot. In the morning, it was emptied, sometimes into a cesspit, but more often simply tossed into the street below. This wasn't a fringe habit. It was the norm across cities in Europe. In cities like Edinburgh, household servants or family members leaned out of upper windows and shouted, "Gardez-l'eau," a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. Only, of course, it wasn't water. Passers-by below would scatter, holding their noses as slop rained down onto the cobblestones. If you weren't fast enough, well, you wore the consequences. The streets became open-air dumping grounds for chamber pot contents, animal waste, food scraps, and rotting garbage. Some cities tried to manage the mess with open gutters running down the center of the street, essentially channels for sewage. Rainwater sometimes carried waste away, but in dry summers, it just sat there, festering under the sun. Bigger homes and businesses might have cesspits, deep holes where waste collected. But these had to be emptied. And that brings us to one of the dirtiest jobs of the century. Enter the night soil men, laborers who came after dark to shovel out cesspits and privies. Armed with buckets, shovels, and a strong stomach, they hauled tons of human waste out of homes and businesses. It was dangerous, back-breaking work. The fumes could overwhelm workers, leading to suffocation in deep pits. Explosions even occurred, since methane gas built up in the waste. Yet the job had to be done. Without night soil men, cesspits overflowed, flooding homes and streets with filth. The collected waste wasn't always discarded either. Sometimes it was sold as fertilizer to farmers. Yes, human manure helped feed the crops that fed the people who, well, you can see the cycle. Now imagine all of this in July. Heat amplified the smell until it clung to every breath. Flies bred in the muck. Rats scurried through piles of refuse, spreading disease from one household to another. Visitors from rural areas often commented on the unbearable odors of cities. For them, the countryside smelled of fields and livestock. But in London, Paris, or Amsterdam, the stink of waste was inescapable, especially in crowded, narrow streets. In fact, London became so infamous for its foul odors that later, in the 19th century, the city's air pollution would be nicknamed the Great Stink. But the problem had been festering for centuries. Waste wasn't just unpleasant, it was deadly. Without knowledge of germs, people didn't understand that drinking water contaminated by sewage caused cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. Outbreaks of disease regularly swept through cities, killing thousands. Doctors sometimes suspected foul air what they called miasma, was to blame. They weren't entirely wrong, since the smell often accompanied contaminated conditions. But the true culprits were the bacteria and parasites thriving in the sewage-soaked environment. Still, for most people, the smell of waste was simply part of life. Of course, not everyone endured the exact same conditions. The wealthy had more elaborate arrangements, private garderobes or water closets that drained into cesspits. Servants carried their chamber pots away discreetly. But even in grand palaces, the problem remained. Versailles, for example, was notorious for its lack of toilets. Visitors described courtiers relieving themselves in stairwells and gardens, leaving the air thick with odors. Luxury didn't guarantee cleanliness. It just meant someone else dealt with the mess. For the poor, sanitation was much worse. Tenement houses crammed multiple families into small spaces with little or no access to private facilities. Chamber pots overflowed. Streets became cesspools. In some areas, pigs roamed freely, feeding on the waste and garbage. Living, snorting garbage disposals. City officials tried to impose regulations, but enforcement was difficult. Waste disposal was everyone's problem, but no one's responsibility. There were, however, efforts to make things better. In the 18th century, inventors and engineers experimented with improved toilets and sewer systems. In Britain, Alexander Cummings patented the S-trap toilet in 1775, which used water to seal in odors, a revolutionary step toward modern plumbing. But widespread adoption was slow. The majority of people still relied on chamber pots and cesspits. Change wouldn't come until urban populations grew so large that the old systems collapsed under the weight of sheer numbers. Perhaps the most fascinating thing is how normalized this all became. People accepted the smell of waste as part of city life. They learned to hold their breath while passing cesspits, to dodge puddles in the street, and to ignore the stench that lingered on their clothes. What we would consider intolerable today was simply background noise in the 18th century. So, if you were to step back in time to an 18th century city, you wouldn't just notice the fashions or the architecture. The first thing to hit you would be the stench. The chamber pots emptied into streets, the cesspits waiting to be shoveled out, the rivers of sewage running underfoot. It was a world where waste was unavoidable, where sanitation was rudimentary, and where summer heat turned cities into choking, reeking ovens. Next time you flush a toilet or turn on a tap, remember, not so long ago, life meant dodging sewage in the streets and hoping the night soil men got there before it overflowed. Close your eyes and picture Versailles in the 18th century. Golden halls, glittering chandeliers, velvet gowns sweeping across polished floors. From a distance, it seems like the very definition of elegance. But if you stepped closer, if you leaned in to greet a courtier, or brushed past a powdered lady in her towering wig, you'd notice something jarring. The smell? Perfume. Powder. Musk layer upon layer of fragrance. Not because people were clean, but because they weren't. In the 18th century, perfume wasn't just about smelling nice. It was soap, deodorant, and sanitizer, all rolled into one. Before we dive into perfume, let's remember why it was needed in the first place. Daily bathing was rare. Many believed that immersing the body in water was dangerous, that it could open the pores to disease. And with water supplies often dirty or limited, they weren't entirely wrong to be cautious. So, instead of scrubbing away odors, people masked them. The unwashed body, soaked in sweat and grime, became a canvas on which perfume was painted. The 18th century saw perfume blossom into a booming industry. France, especially, became the beating heart of fragrance. The town of Grasse in southern France cultivated fields of roses, jasmine, and orange blossoms, all distilled into luxurious scents. Perfume wasn't just a vanity item, it was essential for anyone who wanted to maintain social standing. Nobles drenched themselves in it. Powdered wigs were dusted with lavender or orange water. Even gloves were scented, turning every handshake into a perfumed encounter. Perfume said, "Yes, I may not have bathed, but I still belong in high society." Perfume wasn't alone. Scented powders played a starring role. People dusted their wigs with them, yes, but also their skin, clothes, and even furniture. Women dabbed scented sachets into their corsets. Men carried perfumed handkerchiefs to wave under their noses in foul-smelling streets. Wealthy households burned incense or scattered potpourri to disguise the odors of chamber pots and rotting food. It was less about creating a pleasant smell than it was about waging war against the ever-present stink of daily life. Here's the thing, though. No matter how much perfume was used, the smell of the unwashed body always lingered. And in the 18th century, that was acceptable. People didn't expect anyone to smell fresh the way we do today. The scent of sweat, leather, smoke, and even waste blended into what we might call the smellscape of the time. Perfume didn't erase it. It just added another layer. Think of it like this. If life was a painting, odor was the background color. Everyone smelled, so no one thought it unusual. Perfume wasn't about cleanliness. It was about status, indulgence, and allure. Perfume wasn't just practical. It was intimate. Lovers exchanged scented letters. Courtesans soaked their clothing in musk to create a signature scent. A whiff of perfume wasn't just pleasant, it was suggestive. Writers of the time often described perfume as intoxicating, a weapon of attraction. To wear perfume was to announce oneself, not just as clean, but as desirable. But of course, this desire was layered over the reality of bodies that rarely saw soap and water. Perfume also had a medical role. Remember the miasma theory? The belief that disease spread through bad air? People thought sweet smells could protect them. Perfume bottles were carried like talismans. Their contents sniffed to ward off illness. Doctors recommended aromatic herbs, oils, and perfumes to purify both body and environment. Lavender water might be dabbed on the skin. Rosemary burned in sick rooms. To the 18th century mind, perfume didn't just mask filth, it fought disease. Of course, not everyone had access to perfume. The wealthy could afford the best from Parisian perfumers. They layered musk, ambergris, and floral essences until they practically dripped with fragrance. The poor? They had little more than smoke from their hearths or sprigs of herbs to rub on their clothes. The divide between rich and poor was marked not only by clothing and housing, but by scent. To smell richly perfumed was to smell like money. But even the poor were part of the larger odor culture. Their unwashed bodies blended into the shared aroma of crowded tenements, markets, and taverns. No one expected otherwise. One fascinating thing about perfume in the 18th century was how personal it was. Without modern mass production, each perfume could be unique, mixed by hand by a perfumer. Nobles often commissioned custom scents, turning perfume into a kind of signature. Your scent walked into a room before you did. It lingered after you left. In a world without showers, your chosen perfume was your brand. Of course, here's the irony. The very thing meant to elevate and enchant often mixed poorly with the reality of unwashed skin. Musk and rose overlaying days-old sweat, jasmine mingling with sour breath, powdered wigs hiding the scent of lice and grease. It didn't matter. People accepted the blend as part of life. Perfume wasn't about smelling clean. It was about smelling civilized. Perfume wasn't limited to people. Letters were scented before they were sent. Furniture was polished with perfumed oils. Even pets could be powdered and perfumed to please their owners. The 18th century was, in many ways, an age of fragrance. And yet, at its heart, this obsession with scent was an elaborate disguise, a way to live with dirt while pretending to be refined. So, the next time you spritz on a bit of cologne or dab perfume on your wrist, think of the 18th century. For us, fragrance is the finishing touch on a clean body. For them, it was the substitute for soap and water. Perfume was armor against a smelly world, a declaration of status, and a mask over the realities of hygiene. In an age when bathing was rare and odors unavoidable, perfume didn't just make you smell better. It made you belong. Imagine pulling on the same shirt every day for weeks. No washing machine, no fresh laundry smell, just layers of sweat, smoke, food stains, and the faint musk of your own body clinging to the fabric. Welcome to the 18th century, where clothes rarely touched water, and the idea of freshly laundered was more dream than daily habit. In the modern world, we toss clothes into machines without a second thought. But in the 18th century, washing fabric was an ordeal. Water wasn't always clean, soap was expensive, and scrubbing by hand wore garments down quickly. And remember, people genuinely feared bathing because they thought water could carry disease. That same suspicion carried over to clothing. Washing too often was believed to weaken fabric and invite illness. Better to avoid it altogether. Instead of washing, people relied on layers. Wealthy men and women wore fine outer garments that were rarely cleaned, protected by undergarments like chemises or shirts. The idea was simple. Let the underlayer absorb the sweat and grime, so the visible layers stayed respectable. But here's the catch. Those underlayers weren't washed daily either. A linen shirt or shift might be worn for days, even weeks, before being changed. By then, it was stiff with sweat, yellowed at the collar, and crawling with lice. Doing laundry in the 18th century wasn't just a chore. It was back-breaking labor. Water had to be fetched from wells or pumps, heated in great cauldrons, then mixed with harsh lye soap or even urine, which was used as a bleaching agent. Clothes were scrubbed on boards, boiled, beaten with paddles, and finally wrung out by hand before being hung to dry. For the average household, this was a process that could take days, which meant it wasn't done often. Once a month was common. For poorer families, even less. So, if clothes weren't washed, how did people cope? They aired them out. Garments were hung outside to let the breeze carry away some of the stench. Dresses and coats might be brushed or beaten with sticks to knock off dirt and dust. Linens were spread over bushes in the sun, where the light was thought to purify them. It wasn't cleaning in the way we think of it. It was more like damage control. Just as with the body, perfume came to the rescue. Clothes could be sprinkled with scented powders or spritzed with floral waters. Musk and lavender sachets were sewn into gowns or tucked into pockets. In grand households, servants might burn incense in wardrobes to mask the musty odor of unwashed garments. Once again, the goal wasn't cleanliness, it was disguise. Where there are dirty clothes, there are parasites. Lice, fleas, and mites thrived in the folds of rarely washed fabric. Shirts and chemises, in particular, were prime breeding grounds. Scratching was so common, it barely raised an eyebrow. In fact, delousing one another, picking lice out of seams and collars, became a daily social ritual in some households. In wartime, soldiers' uniforms, never washed, became crawling with vermin. This wasn't just unpleasant. It spread diseases like typhus, which killed more men than bullets. As with most things in the 18th century, there was a divide between classes. The wealthy owned more clothing and could rotate garments. They might change linen underlayers more frequently, sending them to be laundered by servants. Fine gowns and coats, though, were almost never washed. Instead, they were brushed, mended, and perfumed. The poor often had just one or two outfits. When a shirt grew filthy, they wore it anyway. When a dress became too dirty, they might scrape it, beat it, or patch over the stains. Soap was costly, and new clothing even more so. A peasant's clothes could be worn until they literally fell apart. Summer brought particular misery. Heat, sweat, and the stink of bodies made unwashed clothes unbearable. Fleas and lice multiplied. The air was heavy with odors. Winter was different. Fewer baths, fewer laundry days, and the extra layers of wool and fur that trapped odors even more effectively. In either season, the smell of unwashed garments clung to everyone. Despite all this, clothing was still a statement of identity. People judged each other by what they wore, not how clean it was. A fashionable cut or rich fabric could mask the reality that the garment hadn't been washed in months. In fact, many people would rather be smelly in silk than clean in coarse linen. Appearance trumped hygiene. Changing undergarments, called shifting linen, was considered an act of cleanliness in itself. Even if the linen wasn't washed for weeks, simply putting on a fresh shirt was thought to cleanse the body. Writers of the time often equated cleanliness with white linen rather than soap and water. If you wore crisp linen, you were seen as respectable, regardless of the fact that it was probably hiding dirt and sweat. When laundry finally was done, it was an event. Villages would gather near rivers or communal washhouses, women beating and scrubbing clothes while gossiping and trading news. For urban households, washerwomen were hired, their work so physically demanding that it carried a reputation for toughness. The image of the washerwoman, arms red from boiling water, hands rough with lye, became a symbol of working-class endurance. But because of the sheer labor involved, laundry remained infrequent. So imagine the smell of an 18th century street. Not just unwashed bodies, but unwashed clothes, sweat-soaked linen, damp wool, smoky coats, and moth-eaten furs, all aired out, but never truly clean. To our modern noses, it sounds unbearable, but to them, it was normal. The scratch of lice, the reek of stale fabric, the sight of linen yellowing with use, these were everyday realities. Clothes weren't meant to be clean. They were meant to be durable, fashionable, and above all, survivable. In a world where water was feared and laundry was exhausting, people learned to live with dirt and cover it with powder, perfume, and a little bit of pretense. Picture this: a bustling 18th century city street, alive with carts, chatter, and children playing. But lurking in the air, invisible, silent, deadly, are the germs of disease. Typhus, cholera, smallpox, killers that thrived where hygiene was an afterthought. If you lived in this time, you might wash your hands once a week, if at all. Clothes were rarely laundered, streets were festering with waste, and baths were considered dangerous. The link between filth and disease? Completely unknown. Welcome to the world where poor sanitation shaped life and death. The 18th century was a time before germ theory. Doctors and scientists had no idea that tiny microbes caused disease. Instead, they believed in miasma, the idea that bad smells, rotting matter, and noxious air carried illness. So, People avoided what smelled bad, but rarely connected this to their own hygiene habits. A foul-smelling alley? Dangerous? A stinky kitchen? Risky? Their unwashed hands, filthy clothes, and contaminated water? Not a concern. The result was a perfect storm for outbreaks. Typhus was a disease that thrived in dirty conditions. Fleas and lice, ever present in unwashed clothes and bedding, carried the bacteria from person to person. Imagine soldiers in damp uniforms, farmers in sweaty linen, and servants whose clothes were worn for weeks. The itching was relentless, but the lice were more than a nuisance. They were disease vectors. When typhus hit a town, mortality rates soared. People barely understood why it spread so quickly, attributing it to bad air or divine punishment. They washed infrequently, thinking that water itself might make them sick, which only allowed lice to multiply. Cholera outbreaks were another consequence of poor hygiene, but one that people couldn't see. Water sources were often polluted with human waste. Rivers, wells, and fountains carried pathogens directly into households. Drinking contaminated water caused violent diarrhea, dehydration, and often death within days. Entire neighborhoods could be wiped out in a single summer. Despite the clear link, the cause was invisible. People blamed curses, bad food, or the weather, rather than realizing that the way they handled waste and cleaned themselves and their homes was central to the outbreak. Smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases of the century, wasn't caused by filth in the same way as typhus or cholera. It spread person to person. But hygiene still played a role in its transmission. Clothing, bedding, and towels carried the virus from one victim to another. Homes were rarely disinfected, and caring for the sick put families at high risk. Washing hands and using clean linens could have made a difference, but no one knew this. Cities were the worst offenders. Narrow streets were crowded, homes were packed close together, and chamber pots emptied directly into gutters or streets. Waste accumulated in open sewers, breeding bacteria and vermin. In summer, the stench was overwhelming. The air was thick with disease-carrying insects, while the heat accelerated the growth of bacteria in food and water. People lived in close quarters with animals, pigs, chickens, and cows, adding another vector for disease. And yet, bathing and laundry remained minimal. Hygiene practices lagged far behind the reality of disease risk. The concept of public health was in its infancy. There were no municipal sewer systems in most cities. Few regulations governed the disposal of waste. Hospitals were overcrowded and often unsanitary, becoming hotspots for outbreaks rather than safe havens. Quarantine was occasionally used for smallpox or plague, but without understanding germs, measures were inconsistent. Advice ranged from burning incense to fumigate the air, to wearing charms against evil spirits. The truly effective solutions, clean water, sewage management, personal hygiene, were rarely implemented. Even when people tried to be clean, they often made things worse. Bathing was infrequent because of the fear of illness from water. But the same neglect allowed lice, fleas, and bacteria to thrive. Washing clothes too often was feared for weakening the fabric, so garments remained a breeding ground for disease. Kitchens and food preparation areas were rarely sanitized. Waste disposal was minimal. The cumulative effect was constant exposure to pathogens, even for those who considered themselves careful. Outbreaks were frequent and brutal. Typhus could decimate a regiment of soldiers. Cholera could sweep through a village in days. Smallpox killed indiscriminately, leaving survivors scarred and communities devastated. Families lived with the expectation that illness and death were normal parts of life. Hygiene was not yet recognized as a tool to prevent suffering. It was an inconvenience, a luxury, or, at worst, a dangerous habit. The consequences of poor hygiene weren't just health-related. Entire economies suffered when disease struck. Workforces dwindled. Markets and trade slowed. Cities struggled to maintain infrastructure when death and illness were constant companions. Yet, the burden fell disproportionately on the poor. Wealthy families could rotate clothing, hire laundresses, and isolate the sick. Poor families, already stretched thin, faced the worst outcomes. It would take decades, even centuries, for the connection between hygiene and disease to become clear. Scientists like John Snow, who mapped cholera outbreaks, and Ignaz Semmelweis, who promoted hand-washing in hospitals, would eventually illuminate the link. But in the 18th century, germs were invisible, hygiene was optional, and the consequences were deadly. Every unwashed body, every filthy garment, every open sewer contributed to a culture of illness that no one fully understood. If you imagine walking the streets of an 18th century city, the sights and smells tell only part of the story. Beneath the surface, bacteria and viruses were spreading silently from body to body, garment to garment, street to home. People didn't know that their own hygiene could save lives. In their minds, disease was an external force, bad air, bad luck, or divine wrath. And yet, in reality, something as simple as washing hands, laundering clothes, and keeping water clean could have changed the course of history for thousands. The 18th century reminds us that hygiene isn't just about comfort, it's about survival. And without it, even the simplest daily actions became deadly risks. Imagine stepping off a crowded, noisy 18th century city street and onto a quiet country lane. Immediately, there's a shift. The air is cleaner, the stench less oppressive, and the rhythms of life slower. City streets reeked of human and animal waste, rotting food, and the layered filth of thousands of people packed together. Country life? It had its own odors, hay, livestock, and smoke from wood fires. But these were natural, expected, and, to many, far more tolerable. In the 18th century, where you lived often dictated your experience of cleanliness, health, and even social status. Urban centers were hubs of commerce, politics, and culture, but also, inevitably, centers of filth. Streets were narrow and crowded, homes were close together, and ventilation was poor. Chamber pots emptied directly onto the streets. Waste from markets, slaughterhouses, and tanneries added to the mess. During the summer, heat amplified every smell. Fermented garbage, human waste, and stagnant water mingled into a haze that clung to hair, clothes, and the walls of houses. Lice and fleas thrived, feeding on unwashed bodies. Disease spread rapidly, feeding on the lack of hygiene. For city dwellers, this stench was normal. They adapted, covering odors with perfumes, powders, and scented oils. But the underlying filth was impossible to escape. Meanwhile, rural life was different. In the countryside, families lived in detached cottages or farmhouses, often surrounded by open fields. Waste could be composted or dumped far from the home. Rivers and wells were less likely to be contaminated by hundreds of neighbors. Daily life in the country involved labor outdoors. Dirt, sweat, and animal smells were inevitable, but these were diluted by fresh air. Bathing, while still infrequent, felt less hazardous because the water was cleaner and the risk of disease transmission lower. Clothes could be hung on lines to air out in the sun, which naturally killed some germs. Farmers, shepherds, and peasants often considered themselves healthier and cleaner than city folk. To them, urban residents were trapped in a concentrated stew of filth and sickness. The divide between city and countryside was not just about smell. It shaped health and social perceptions. Cities had a higher density of people, so poor hygiene led to faster spreading epidemics. Typhus, cholera, and smallpox swept through towns, whereas rural villages often experienced outbreaks less frequently or on a smaller scale. City dwellers might have the luxury of occasional perfumed baths and fancy clothing, but these were often cosmetic fixes that couldn't mask the underlying filth. Rural inhabitants, while poor, could maintain a more practical cleanliness. Fresh water, open spaces, and less constant human contact made a difference. This difference gave rise to a recurring social judgment. City folk were dirtier, not just in body, but in lifestyle. They were seen as indulgent, overcrowded, and prone to disease, a stark contrast to the seemingly wholesome, self-reliant country life. Housing reinforced the divide. Urban homes were small, often shared by multiple families. Floors were rarely scrubbed, and furniture was layered with dust, sweat, and grime. Beds were stuffed with straw or feathers that were seldom changed, making them prime breeding grounds for lice and fleas. In the countryside, homes were also modest, but the open design and space around buildings allowed for more practical hygiene. Dirt floors were swept, and animals often had separate quarters. Bedding could be rotated, aired, or replaced more easily. Washing water could be drawn from cleaner sources, and clothes could be hung outdoors to sun and fresh air. Even when bathing was rare, the combination of fresh air, sun, and outdoor labor in rural areas contributed to a level of cleanliness that city dwellers often envied. Occupations played a role, too. In cities, street vendors, butchers, tanners, and leather workers produced intense odors. Workers handled raw animal products in enclosed spaces, adding to the stench of streets and homes. In rural areas, labor was largely outdoors. Farmers smelled of soil, sweat, and livestock, but these were transient odors. A hard day's work could be followed by airing out clothes or washing in a nearby stream, simple practices that reduce the constant presence of filth. This practical outdoor exposure also helped rural communities cope with dirt. They didn't need perfumes to mask smells. They could rely on sunlight, wind, and movement. Interestingly, some urban elites paradoxically equated perfume with sophistication, even though it often disguised severe neglect. They believed that masking odors was a mark of refinement. Country folk, observing this, often considered city dwellers not only physically dirty, but morally indulgent. Perfume could hide grime temporarily, but it could not change the cramped living conditions, contaminated water, and constant risk of disease. In essence, rural inhabitants saw themselves as healthier, more natural, and more in tune with the practicalities of hygiene, even if their actual bathing habits were similar to those of city dwellers. The differences in cleanliness between city and countryside were not merely perceptual. Crowded urban living fueled epidemics. Contaminated water, poor waste management, and close human contact made city outbreaks frequent and deadly. Rural areas had more space to isolate the sick, cleaner water sources, and fewer vectors for lice and fleas. However, rural populations weren't immune. Outbreaks still occurred, and access to medical care was limited. But the slower transmission rate and lower population density gave the countryside an advantage in surviving disease seasons. This divide shaped cultural narratives. Urban residents were seen as sophisticated, yet fragile, addicted to perfumes, fashions, and crowded lifestyles that made them vulnerable. Country folk were viewed as hardy, grounded, and resilient, capable of managing dirt and disease in practical ways. Writers and travelers of the era often remarked on this contrast. Letters and journals describe the shock of entering a city, the stench of the streets, the suffocating crowds, the constant presence of waste. By contrast, the countryside offered respite, clean air, and a sense of balance between work, nature, and hygiene. Hygiene in the 18th century was never uniform. It was shaped by environment, resources, culture, and knowledge, or the lack thereof. Cities concentrated humanity in ways that amplified the consequences of poor hygiene, while the countryside allowed space, fresh air, and simpler practices to reduce the same risks. From the perspective of an 18th century villager, city dwellers were indulgent, cramped, and dirty. From our perspective, the rural advantage was both practical and survival-oriented. It's a reminder that cleanliness is not just a personal choice. It's shaped by environment, society, and access to resources. In the 18th century, smell, hygiene, and health were intertwined with geography and lifestyle. The country offered relief from the stench and sickness of the city, but both shared the overarching truth. Without understanding germs, disease, and sanitation, everyone was vulnerable, just in different ways. If you stepped into an 18th century household, the first thing you'd notice might not be the grandeur or the decor. It would be the invisible divide between how men and women approached cleanliness. Hygiene wasn't just about health. It was a social marker, a gendered ritual, and sometimes a performance. Men and women navigated the same filthy world, yet their strategies and priorities differed dramatically. For both sexes, life in the 18th century involved dirt, sweat, and disease. Streets, homes, and workplaces reeked. Bathing was rare, laundry infrequent, and lice and fleas thrived on unwashed bodies. Yet, survival shaped hygiene practices differently for men and women. Men often engaged in labor outdoors, farming, trades, military service, so their dirt was functional. Soil, sweat, and soot were badges of work. Practicality ruled. Daily washing was uncommon, but so was the societal pressure to appear beautiful. Clean clothes, if available, were worn when necessary, but the focus was on utility. Women, in contrast, navigated a world where appearance and status were closely tied to hygiene, especially among the elite. Dirt was not just unpleasant. It could signal social inferiority. A woman's hygiene, her skin, her hair, and her scent became an elaborate language of social standing. At the royal court, women's hygiene was both meticulous and paradoxical. Baths were infrequent, yet scented powders, oils, and perfumes covered the body. Skin was whitened with lead-based cosmetics. Hair was powdered and sculpted into elaborate shapes, often augmented with wigs or padding. These rituals were labor-intensive. Women might spend hours brushing, powdering, and perfuming, creating an illusion of cleanliness. In reality, many of these practices did little to remove dirt or kill bacteria. Yet in a world where daily bathing was rare, perfume and cosmetics acted as a socially sanctioned mask for what could not be washed away. Men of the elite also engaged in grooming, wigs, scented handkerchiefs, and perfumed coats, but generally with less obsession than women. Appearance was important for status, but extreme beauty rituals were largely reserved for women. Outside palaces and salons, the hygiene divide was just as pronounced, though for different reasons. Rural men and women faced dirt constantly. Washing was minimal, water limited, and labor demanded endurance. Men handled heavy work, plowing fields, tending animals, or crafting goods. Dirt was inevitable. A day's sweat and grime was part of life, and socially acceptable. Women, meanwhile, juggled labor and household management. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, and cared for children. Their exposure to dirt was constant, But social expectations often dictated that they appear presentable, at least in public or during visits. Even without courtly rituals, women were pressured to maintain appearances. Neat hair, relatively clean clothes, and no offensive odor. Clothing amplified the divide. Men's clothes were functional: breeches, coats, and work shirts that could be worn repeatedly without washing. If a garment smelled, it was often aired out rather than laundered. Women's clothing, especially in towns or among the gentry, demanded more attention. Layers of petticoats, stays, and skirts could trap sweat and dirt, yet laundering was difficult. Instead, women relied on powders, starches, and airing to keep garments seemingly clean. Perfumed handkerchiefs or sachets were tucked into clothing to mask odors, a portable, gender-specific form of hygiene. This meant that women spent more time managing cleanliness visually and olfactorily, while men could focus on practical cleanliness, leaving smells and grime largely unchecked unless it affected status or comfort. Hair care further illustrates the divide. Elite men and women both wore wigs, but styles differed. Women's wigs were larger, more elaborate, and often powdered to dazzling heights. Men's wigs, while fashionable, were smaller and less ostentatious. Maintaining these wigs required powdering, brushing, and perfuming, a form of hygiene that was more about aesthetics than health. Lice and fleas thrived under these elaborate creations, but social convention prioritized appearance over practical cleanliness. Women also used oils and pomades on their natural hair to style it under wigs or when revealing parts of their hair. Men might use similar products, but less frequently, and typically only to maintain a well-groomed appearance for court or public events. Perfume was gendered too. Women were expected to smell pleasant, floral, light, and delicate, masking the realities of infrequent bathing. Men could wear scent, but it was often stronger, muskier, and socially optional. This wasn't just cosmetic. It reinforced the notion that women's hygiene was a public duty. A woman's scent could signify status, virtue, and desirability. A man's scent, by contrast, was less scrutinized unless he was courting or attending formal gatherings. Even children were not immune to the gendered hygiene divide. Girls were often taught early to attend to appearances: hair brushed, hands washed, clothes neat. Boys were encouraged to play, work, and get dirty. Their hygiene expectations were lower, practical, and functional. This early socialization reinforced lifelong patterns: women navigating the tension between dirt and social expectation, men prioritizing utility and endurance over aesthetics. A fascinating irony emerges. Women with elaborate beauty rituals were often less practically clean than men. Soaps and perfumes could mask dirt, but lice, fleas, and bodily grime persisted. Men, though messier, sometimes benefited from more practical hygiene: washing hands or face with water when possible, airing out clothes, and laboring outdoors, which incidentally reduced lice infestations. In short, gender dictated not only perception, but also the methods and priorities of hygiene. For women, appearance often trumped practicality. For men, survival and function usually came first. Writers and observers of the 18th century frequently remarked on this divide. Diaries from visiting nobles described women's obsessive powdering, perfumes, and wigs, contrasting it with men's less elaborate grooming. Physicians even warned that excessive cosmetics could harm health, but such advice often fell on deaf ears. Appearance was power, particularly for women in courtly or urban society. Meanwhile, rural observers saw the irony plainly. Women might look spotless, while men, seemingly filthy, were healthier and more robust. benefiting from practical exposure to sun, air, and water. The gender divide in 18th century hygiene reminds us that cleanliness was never just about water and soap. It was about social expectation, survival, and identity. Women were judged by appearances, scent, and elaborate rituals, while men navigated the practical realities of labor, dirt, and occasional perfuming. In this world, a lady's powder masked lice, sweat, and disease, while a laborer's grime spoke of work and survival. Hygiene was a lens into social roles, gender norms, and the paradoxes of a society obsessed with appearances, yet ignorant of germs. The 18th century teaches a fascinating lesson. Cleanliness was never purely personal. It was deeply cultural, gendered, and strategic. What you washed, how often and why, was tied not only to health, but to who you were expected to be. Imagine being told that washing your body could make you sick. Sounds absurd today, right? But in the 18th century, such beliefs weren't fringe. They were mainstream. Religion, superstition, and a fundamental misunderstanding of the human body shaped hygiene practices in ways that seem shocking to us now. Bathing, far from being a daily ritual, was often feared. People avoided water not because it wasn't available, but because they believed it could open the pores and invite disease straight into the body. The prevailing medical theory of the time centered on humors and the balance of bodily fluids. Doctors warned that cold water, sudden drafts, or even sweat removed in a bath could disrupt this balance. Many believed that the skin acted as a protective barrier. Wash too much, and you risked opening the pores, letting in miasmas, evil spirits, or illness. A bath wasn't just a simple hygiene act. It was a potential health hazard. This fear of water was reinforced by anecdotes. If someone caught a chill after bathing, neighbors assumed the water caused the sickness. Over time, this caution became a cultural norm, deeply embedded in daily life. Religion played a dual role. On one hand, spiritual texts emphasized purification, ritual washing, ablutions, and hand-washing before prayers. These acts were symbolic, linking cleanliness with virtue and devotion rather than physical hygiene. On the other hand, some religious authorities propagated caution around baths, particularly full-body immersion. The reasoning? Extreme exposure to water could weaken the spirit, or in some beliefs, invite moral corruption or disease. For instance, sermons often warned that indulgent bathing distracted from spiritual focus. Women who bathed too frequently were sometimes labeled vain, immodest, or morally suspect. Men, though less scrutinized for vanity, were still warned against overindulgence in water, which could sap vitality and strength. Beyond religion, superstition shaped hygiene in practical life. People feared that washing could awaken latent illnesses, or that cold water could shock the system. Mothers warned children that bathing in the morning could invite coughs or fevers. Water itself was sometimes considered contaminated or magical in ways that made bathing dangerous. Rivers and wells were suspected of carrying invisible disease, reinforcing the avoidance of regular baths. Some believed that illnesses like smallpox or typhus could be contracted through bathing or sweating too much. These beliefs were not mere ignorance. They were attempts to make sense of mysterious and deadly outbreaks without understanding germs. Paradoxically, recurring epidemics reinforced these hygiene myths. During outbreaks of cholera, typhus, or plague, public health knowledge was rudimentary. People observed that some who bathed fell ill and concluded causation where there was only coincidence. Churches and town councils sometimes issued advice, cautioning against bathing during epidemics, further cementing fear. Clean water, oddly, became suspect precisely because it was associated with sickness, not health. These beliefs created unusual hygiene routines. People relied on dry cleaning, wiping themselves with cloths, brushing the skin, or using powders rather than water. Clothes were aired out, scented with herbs, or sprinkled with perfumes to mask odor without washing. Men and women alike used linen undergarments as buffers, changing them periodically while avoiding actual immersion. Children were kept mostly dry, with sponge baths rather than full-body washing. Even among the wealthy, bathing was ritualized and rare, often limited to cold water dips in rivers or occasional warm baths. Perfumes, scented oils, and powders substituted for soap, and layers of clothing acted as protection against miasmas more than actual dirt. These myths weren't confined to the illiterate or rural populations. They were widely accepted across social classes. Letters, diaries, and household manuals show repeated warnings about bathing and water exposure. Books on domestic management often advised caution. Take care that no child or lady bathe too freely, lest the humors be disturbed. Physicians, though sometimes aware of cleanliness benefits, often deferred to superstition or religious norms to avoid contradicting societal beliefs. Interestingly, fear of bathing even affected social rituals. Noblewomen might postpone a wedding bath or limit personal washing for ceremonial events, fearing it could affect fertility or bring misfortune. Men sometimes avoided baths before duels or hunts, believing exposure could sap courage or vitality. The consequences were profound. Avoidance of water contributed to lice, fleas, body odor, and the spread of disease. Skin infections went untreated. Clothes, rarely washed, harbored parasites. Yet people felt morally and physically justified. Hygiene myths offered a framework for understanding a dangerous and unpredictable world. By avoiding baths, they believed they were protecting themselves, when in reality, they were often increasing vulnerability to illness. Even within this superstitious framework, contradictions appeared. Some physicians recommended bathing in hot water, herbal infusions, or steam treatments, believing heat could close pores and protect the body. Wealthy urbanites, exposed to French or Italian ideas of cleanliness, sometimes adopted more frequent washing rituals, but they still masked bathing with perfumes, powders, and ritualized airings of garments. Myth and practical cleanliness existed in a tense dance, with superstition often dominating decision-making. The 18th century shows us that hygiene is not just a matter of knowledge or resources, it is also cultural, moral, and psychological. People didn't lack water or soap entirely. They lacked the understanding to connect washing with health. Superstition, religion, and anecdotal evidence dictated behavior. Bathing was feared, smells were tolerated, and perfumes substituted for cleanliness. In many ways, fear dictated hygiene more than filth itself. When we look back, it's easy to laugh at the idea that water could be dangerous. But for people in the 18th century, this was reality. Beliefs about pores, spirits, humors, and divine protection shaped daily life, social norms, and public health in ways that left their mark on society and on the human body. Understanding these myths gives us a window into a world where dirt, disease, and superstition were inseparable, and where the simple act of bathing carried risks far beyond what we would ever imagine today. Hygiene, in this context, was never just physical. It was moral, spiritual, and deeply cultural. And for centuries, the human body paid the price for these beliefs. If you were dropped into the 18th century, the smell of the streets might overwhelm you. Chamber pots lined the alleys, powdered wigs swarmed with lice, and the average person bathed maybe once a month, if that. But by the late 1700s, The winds of change were beginning to stir. Knowledge, science, and simple practicality started to challenge centuries of superstition. Slowly, water began to shift from something feared to something essential. The late 18th century was a time of curiosity and experimentation. Physicians and natural philosophers started to observe patterns in disease, hygiene, and cleanliness. Although the germ theory of disease, understanding that invisible microbes cause illness, was still decades away, careful observation hinted at something profound. Filth, rotting waste, and unwashed bodies correlated with sickness. For example, doctors noticed that outbreaks of typhus, cholera, and smallpox were more severe in crowded, unsanitary environments. While they couldn't identify bacteria under a microscope yet, patterns were emerging. The idea that cleanliness could prevent illness was quietly taking root. One of the earliest signs of change was the gradual acceptance of public bathhouses. These weren't just luxuries for the wealthy. They became centers where ordinary citizens could bathe more frequently. In cities like London, Paris, and Amsterdam, bathhouses evolved from mere curiosities to practical hubs for hygiene. People began to understand that water, when used carefully, was not a threat, but a tool for health. Bathhouses also served as social spaces, making bathing a shared cultural activity rather than a feared isolation. The rituals of washing, scrubbing, and soaking slowly gained legitimacy. Soap, which had long been a rare and expensive commodity, started to become more widely available. Early soap makers experimented with animal fats and lye, and by the late 1700s, small-scale production made soap accessible to more households. Soap wasn't just about smell, it was about practical cleanliness. People could scrub away dirt, grease, and grime, reducing lice infestations and other parasitic problems. Although the concept of germs remained mysterious, the results were tangible. Cleaner hands, cleaner bodies, and fewer foul odors. The production and marketing of soap began to link cleanliness with morality and health. Advertisements promised not just fragrance, but protection from sickness. This was the beginning of a cultural shift. Bathing became associated with virtue as well as hygiene. By the end of the 18th century, wealthier households were experimenting with daily or weekly washing routines. Linen undergarments were changed more frequently. Clothes were laundered more often. Even in the countryside, folk remedies for skin cleaning, like herbal baths, vinegar washes, or steam treatments, gained popularity. These practices reflected a slow, experimental move away from superstition. People began to prioritize practical cleanliness alongside moral and aesthetic ideals. Some physicians took bold steps in linking hygiene and health. They observed that soldiers, factory workers, and sailors who washed regularly were less prone to disease outbreaks. Military hospitals began enforcing basic cleanliness, washing sheets, airing clothing, and cleaning wounds carefully. Though the underlying reason, germs, was unknown, these observations laid the groundwork for modern hygiene. Repetition, pattern recognition, and careful documentation gradually replaced superstition as the guiding principle. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and observation, played a critical role. Philosophers and scientists encouraged empirical study over fear or tradition. Ideas about cleanliness, health, and public welfare began to circulate widely. Pamphlets, books, and newspapers began to discuss practical hygiene. Advice for washing children, airing clothes, and maintaining clean homes spread from intellectual circles to the general public. Slowly, the idea that hygiene could be a form of personal and societal improvement took hold. Change was not immediate or universal. Centuries of superstition die hard. Many still feared baths, believing cold water could chill the body or open the pores to disease. Perfume and powder remained popular substitutes for water. Yet even among skeptics, practical improvements took hold. Soap was cheaper, water was more accessible, and public bathhouses offered a safe communal way to experiment with bathing. Social pressure, along with tangible health benefits, encouraged even cautious citizens to wash more frequently. Cities began experimenting with sanitation reforms. Streets were cleaned more regularly, and waste disposal systems were slowly introduced to reduce disease outbreaks. While rudimentary by modern standards, these initiatives reflected an emerging understanding. Cleanliness mattered, and the environment could influence health. Some communities instituted rules for clean streets, proper waste disposal, and the establishment of bathhouses or washing facilities for the poor. Slowly, hygiene became not just a private practice, but a public concern. By the turn of the 19th century, the stage was set for the next revolution. Early experiments in cleanliness, combined with observation and reason, paved the way for germ theory and systematic public health measures. People were still far from the daily showers and sanitizing routines we take for granted today, but the cultural shift had begun. Fear of water was giving way to curiosity, experimentation, and recognition of the benefits of bathing. Today, we step into showers without a second thought. Soap, hot water, and running taps are a given. But for most of human history, water was more feared than embraced. Imagine living in a world where a bath could be dangerous, where perfume substituted for washing, and where dirt and lice were normal companions. The late 18th century marks the first step away from that reality. A time when observation, reason, and small innovations began to rewrite the rules of daily life. The stench of the streets, the fear of water, and the rituals of powders and perfumes slowly gave way to a new understanding. Cleanliness mattered, not just for virtue, but for survival. The journey from superstition to hygiene was long, painful, and uneven. But every bath taken, every scrub with soap, and every clean garment was a tiny victory against centuries of fear. Next time you turn on a hot shower, remember this. For most of history, bathing was a luxury, a danger, or even a moral risk. The late 18th century may have seemed ordinary in many ways, but it set in motion a transformation that would change the human body and society forever.